Okay, chapter 12. And what did we read on chapter 11. Excuse me. Okay, so we read here, okay, that little Ann almost died in this chapter, right? So, and he didn't tell his mom or his dad because he didn't want them to get worried and mom not to let him go out and hunt again. So that's what happened in chapter 11. Little Ann almost died. The fame of my dogs spread all over our part of the Ozarks. They were the best in the country. No coon hunter came into my grandfather's store with as many pelts as I did. Grandpa never overlooked an opportunity to brag. He told everyone the story of my dogs and the part he had played in getting them. Many was the so Grandpa was always bragging that he helped him get the dogs, and Billy was getting the most coon hides than anybody else. Many was the time some farmer coming to our home would say, "Your grandpa was telling me you got 3 big coons over in Peavine Hollow the other night." I would listen knowing I only got 1 or maybe none, but Grandpa was my pal. If he said I caught 10 in one tree, it was just that way. So Grandpa would exaggerate and make up stories about how many coons Billy caught. But since Grandpa was his pal, he just went along with it. He's like, "Yeah, sure I did." You know, when people would say, "Oh, your grandpa told me this and your grandpa told me that," Billy would go along with it because Grandpa was his pal. Because of my grandfather's bragging and his firm belief in my dogs and me, a terrible thing happened. One morning while having breakfast, Mama said to Papa, "I'm a little out of cornmeal. Do you think you can go to the mill today?" Okay. Papa said, "I intended to butcher a hog. We're about out of meat." Looking at me, he said, "Shell a sack of corn. Take one of the mules and go to the mill for your mother." Okay, so Billy had to go to get the cornmeal, to get the corn milled into cornmeal. With the help of my sisters, we shelled the corn. Throwing it over our mule's back, I started for the store. On arriving at the mill house, I tied my mule to the hitching post, took my corn and set it out by the door. I walked over to the store and told Grandpa I wanted to get some corn ground. He said, "I'll be with you in just a minute." As I was waiting, I heard a horse coming. Looking out, I saw who it was and didn't like what I saw. It was the 2 youngest Pritchard boys. I had run into them on several occasions during pie suppers and dances. So I wonder why Billy saw these Pritchard boys on horses, and he said he didn't like what he saw. And he's at his grandpa's store just trying to get the corn ground up into cornmeal, and that he sees these guys coming. And Billy said he's seen them in different kind of events. The Pritchards were a large family that lived upriver about 5 miles. As in most small country communities, there is one family that no one likes. The Pritchards were it. Tales were told that they were bootleggers, thieves, and just all around no accounts. The story had gone round that old man Pritchard had killed a man somewhere in Missouri before moving to our part of the country. Okay, so the Pritchards family was not well liked. People would say stories about them and say that they were bootleggers. Back in the day, alcohol used to be illegal, and they would sneak alcohol. The people who snuck alcohol, they would wear really big pants and they would hide them in their pants, so that's why they called them bootleggers. Thieves, they said they were stealing as well, and they were just overall no good people. Okay, and then the father of the family, everybody thought that he had killed a man in Missouri before he even moved to that part of the country where they were now. Reuben was 2 years older than I, big and husky for his age. He never had much to say. He had mean-looking eyes that were set far back in his rugged face. They were smoky-hued and unblinking, as if the eyelids were paralyzed. I had heard once that he had cut a boy with a knife in a fight over at the sawmill. Okay, so he said this guy Reuben, he's one of the sons, and he has such mean looking eyes that don't even blink, and it looked like the eyelids were just paralyzed. And he saw him cut a boy with a knife in a fight. So Rainey was the youngest, about my age. He had the meanest disposition of any boy I had ever known. Because of this, he was disliked by young and old. Wherever Rainey went, trouble seemed to follow. He was always wanting to bet and would bet on anything. He was nervous and could never seem to stand still. So he was always kind of betting on things, probably to make some money, because he would say, I'll bet you $5, or I'll bet you, probably not $5, because back in the day they didn't have that much money, but maybe 5 cents or something. And then he seemed to be hyper. Once at my grandfather's store, I had given him a piece of candy. Snatching it out of my hand, he ate it and then sneered at me and said it wasn't any good. During a pie supper one night, he went to bet a dime that he could whip me. He wanted to bet a dime that he could whip me. So one time Billy gave this little guy, what was his name, Rainey, he gave Rainey a candy, and he snatched it out of his hand, didn't say thank you or anything, ate it, and then said, ugh, that wasn't even good. So that's rude. And then during a pie supper one night, he said, I bet you 10 cents that I can beat you up. My mother always told me to be kind of Rainey, that he couldn't help being the way he was. I asked, why? She said it was because his brothers were always picking on him and beating him. Oh, poor Rainey. So he was the little one, it seems like. Yeah, he was the youngest. So and his brothers were always picking on him and beating him up. So she just said, just be kind to Rainey. He has a lot going on. On entering the store, they stopped and glared at me. Reuben walked over to the counter. Rainey came over to me. Leering at me, he said, I'd like to make a bet with you. I told him I didn't want to bet. He asked if I was scared. No, I just don't want to bet, I said. His neck and ears looked as if though they hadn't been washed in months. His ferret-like eyes kept darting here and there. Glancing down to his hands, I saw the back of his right sleeve was stiff and starchy from the constant wiping of his nose. Oh, poor guy. So it sounds like Rainey's just not really well taken care of. He said his neck and ears looked like they hadn't been washed in months, so he's not taking good showers. And then he's been like wiping his snot on his shirt, so it was already like stiff and hard from all of that. Gross. But poor Rainey. He saw I was looking him over and asked if I liked what I saw. So he saw him looking at him, and he said, do you like what you see? I started to say no, but didn't. Turned and walked away a few steps. Reuben ordered some chewing tobacco. Aren't you a little young to be chewing, Grandpa said. Ain't for me, it's for my dad, Reuben growled. Grandpa handed 2 plugs to him. He paid for it, turned around, and handed 1 plug to Rainey. Holding the other in front of him, he looked it over, Looking at Grandpa, he gnawed at one corner of it. Grandpa mumbled something about how kids were brought up these days. He came from behind the counter saying to me, let's go grind that corn. Okay, so Grandpa gave them the 2 chewing tobaccos that they asked for. And what was the other kid's name? I'm not remembering their names really well. Reuben and Rainey. So Reuben paid for that chewing tobacco and gave 1 to Rainey. And right away they started chewing on it right in front of Grandpa when they said it was for their dad. So they're doing bad stuff. Grandpa mumbled something about how kids were brought up these days. He came from behind the counter saying to me, let's go grind corn. So Grandpa and Billy were going to go grind the corn. The Pritchard boys made no move to follow us out of the store. Come on, Grandpa said. I'm going to lock up till I get this corn ground. We'll just stay here. I want to look at some of the shirts, said Reuben. No, you won't, said Grandpa. Come on, I'm going to lock up. Begrudgingly, they walked out. So Grandpa was not going to leave them in the store alone because they were known to be like thieves, so they might steal something. I helped Grandpa start the mill, and we proceeded to grind the corn. The Pritchard boys had followed us and were standing looking on. Rainey walked over to me. I hear you have some good hounds, he said. I told him I had the best in the country. If he didn't believe me, he could just ask my grandfather. He just leered at me. I don't think they're half as good as you say they are, he said. Bet our old blue tick hound can out-hunt both of them. So Rainey saying, no, they're not. Your hounds are not that good, and our old blue tick hound can hunt better than both of your hounds. I laughed. Asked Grandpa who brings in the most hides. I wouldn't believe him. He's crooked, he said. I let him know right quick that my grandfather wasn't crooked. So Rainey said, oh, I'm not going to believe your grandpa. He's a storekeeper, ain't he? He said. I glanced over at Grandpa. He had heard the remark made by Rainey. His friendly old face was red as a turkey gobbler's waddle. The last of my corn was just going through the grinding stones. Grandpa pushed a lever to one side, shutting off the power. He came over and said to Rainey, what do you do? Just go around looking for trouble? What do you want, a fight? Reuben sidled over. This ain't none of your business, he said. Besides, Rainey's not looking for a fight. We just want to make a bet with him. Okay. So they're saying, we're not trying to fight. We just want to bet that our hound can out-hunt his hounds. Grandpa glared at Reuben. Any bet you would make sure would be a good one, all right. What kind of bet? Reuben spat a mouthful of tobacco juice on the clean floor. He said, well, we've heard so much about them hounds of his. We just think it's a lot of talk and lies. We'd like to make a little bet, say about $2. I'd never seen my old grandfather so mad. The red had left his face. In its place was a stickly, pasty gray color. The kind old eyes behind the glasses burned with fire I had never seen. In a loud voice he said, bet on what? Reuben spat again. Grandpa's eyes followed the brown stain of its arch until it landed on the clean floor and splattered. With a leering grin on his ugly, dirty face, Reuben said, well, we got an old coon in our part of the country that's been there a long time. Ain't no dog yet ever been smart enough to treat him. And Rainey broke into conversation. He ain't just an ordinary coon. He's an old-timer. Folks call him the ghost coon. Believe me, he is a ghost. He just runs hounds long enough to get them all warmed up, then climbs a tree and disappears. Our old blue hound has treed him more times than... Ruby told Rainey to shut up and let him do the talking. Looking over at him, he said, what do you say? Want to bet $2 your hounds can tree him? I looked at my grandfather, but he didn't help me. I told Reuben I didn't want to bet, but I was pretty sure my dogs could tree the ghost coon. Okay, so they want they want to make a bet with him that if Billy wins, then they'll give him $2. If this coon that they're talking about, if the dogs can put that coon inside of the tree, if Billy's dogs can. If the dogs can't, then now Billy owes them the $2. Rainey butted in again. What's the matter? You yellow? I felt the hot blood rush into my face. My stomach felt like something alive was crawling in it. I doubled up my right fist and was on the point of hitting Rainey in one of his eyes when I felt my grandfather's hand on my shoulder. I looked up. His eyes flashed as he looked at me. A strange little smile was tugging at the corner of his mouth. The big artery in his neck was pounding in and out and in. It reminded me of a young bird that had fallen out of a nest and lay dying on the ground. Still looking at me, he reached back and took his billful from his pocket, saying, Let's call that bet. Turning to Reuben, he said, I'm going to let you call your bet, but now you listen. If you boys take him up there to hunt the ghost coon and jump on him and beat him up, you're sure going to hear from me. I don't mean maybe. I'll have you both taken to Tahlequah and put in jail. You better believe that. So Grandpa's telling these two boys, if you just try to take Billy up there so you guys can beat him up, then I'm going to make sure you guys go to jail. So if you're actually going to go to just hunt the coon and see if Billy's coons can do it, then that's fine. You guys can have the bet. But if you guys are going to just try and beat Billy up and trick him into coming with you, you're going to go to jail. So you better not. Reuben saw he had pushed my grandfather far enough. Backing up a couple steps, he said, We're not going to jump on him. All we want to do is make a bet. Grandpa handed me two $1 bills, saying to Reuben, You hold your money and he can hold his. If you lose, you better pay off. Looking back to me, he said, Son, if you lose, pay off. I nodded my head. I asked Reuben when he wanted me to come up for the hunt. He thought a minute. You know where that old log slide comes out from the hills on the road, he asked. I nodded. We'll meet you there tomorrow night about dark, he said. It was fine with me, I said, but I told him not to bring his hounds because mine wouldn't hunt with other dogs. He said he wouldn't. I agreed to bring my axe and lantern. As they turned to leave, Rainey smirked. "Sucker," he said. I made no reply. So, okay, so tomorrow night, they agreed that Billy's going to come up to where they told him to meet, and he's going to bring his 2 little hounds, and they're going to go and try to get this coon, get him into a tree. And if they can get him into a tree, then that means that Billy's going to win the bet, and he gets $2 from them. But if Billy loses and his coons cannot get this coon in a tree, then they have to pay Billy $2. After the Pritchard boys had gone, my grandfather looked at me and said, "Son, I have never asked another man for much, but I sure want you to catch the ghost coon." Grandpa's so mad because the boys are just like, just being disrespectful. So Grandpa really wants Billy to catch this coon so that he can show those 2 boys. I told him if the ghost coon made 1 track in the river bottoms, my dogs would get him. Grandpa laughed. "You'd better be getting home. It's getting late and your mother's waiting for the cornmeal," he said. I could hear him chuckling as he walked toward his store. I thought to myself, there goes the best grandpa a boy ever had. Oh, that's so nice. Lifting the sack of meal to the back of my old mule, I started for home. All the way, I kept thinking of old Dan, little Ann, ghost coons, and the 2 ugly, dirty Pritchard boys. I decided not to tell my mother and father anything about the hunt, for I knew Mama wouldn't approve of anything I had to do with the Pritchards. Okay, so again, he didn't tell his parents because he wanted to get this done, and he thought his mom wouldn't let him. The following evening, I arrived at the designated spot early. I sat down by a red oak tree to wait. I called little Ann over to me and had a good talk with her. I told her how much I loved her, scratched her back, and looked at the pads of her feet. "Sweetheart," I said, "you must do something for me tonight. I want you to treat the ghost coon, for it means so much to Grandpa and me." She seemed to understand and answered by washing my face and hands. I tried to talk to old Dan, but I may as well have talked to a stump for all the attention he paid me. He kept walking around sniffing here and there. He couldn't understand why we were waiting. He was wanting to hunt. So Billy's getting ready. He gets his dogs, and he went over to the spot early, okay, where he's supposed to meet the Pritchard boys. And he sat down to wait, and he talked to his dogs. And little Ann seemed to understand what he wanted, but old Dan was just really impatient and wanting to hurry up and hunt. What are we waiting for? He didn't understand that they're waiting for the Pritchard boys. Reuben and Rainey showed up just at dark. Both had sneers on their faces. "Are you ready?" Reuben asked. "Yes," I said, and I asked him which way was the best to go. "Let's go down river a way and work up," he said. "We're sure to strike him coming up river, and that way we've got the wind in our favor." "Are these the hounds that we've been hearing so much about?" Rainey asked. I nodded. They look too little to be any good," he said. I told him dynamite came in little packages. So they're little coons. So Rainey's saying, they're way too little. Are they even going to be good? And Billy said, yes, they will be. Little things, big things come in small packages. He asked me if I had my $2. Yes, I said. He wanted to see the money. I showed it to him. Reuben, not to be outdone, showed me his. We crossed an old field and entered the river bottoms. By this time it was quite dark. I lit my lantern and asked which one wanted to carry my axe. It's yours, Rainey said. You carry it. Not wanting to argue, I carried both the lantern and the axe. Rainey started telling me how stingy and crooked my grandfather was. I told him I hadn't come to have any trouble or to fight. Oh my goodness. So they're telling, and these boys, they probably just want free stuff and Grandpa's not giving it to them. So then they're saying he's stingy and crooked. But no, he's running a business. All I wanted to do was to hunt the ghost coon. If there was going to be any trouble, I would just call my dogs and go home. Reuben had a nickel's worth of sense, but Rainey had none at all. Reuben told him if he didn't shut up, he was going to bloody his nose. That shut Rainey up. So Rainey stopped talking about his grandpa because they wanted to go ahead and try and see who would win the bet. And Rainey, since he's the youngest, he just wouldn't stop until Reuben threatened him. Old Dan opened up first. It was a beautiful thing to hear. The deep tones of his voice rolled in the silent night. A bird in a canebrake on our right started chirping. A big swamp rabbit came running down the riverbank as if all hell was close to his heels. A bunch of mallards feeding in the shallows across the river took flight with frightened quacks. A feeling that only a hunter knows slowly crept over my body. I whooped to my dogs, urging them on. Okay, so old Dan started whooping, so it seems like he's on a trail. Little Ann came in. Her bell-like tones blended with old Dan's in perfect rhythm. We stood and listened to the beautiful music, the deep-throated notes of hunting hounds on the hot-scented trail of a river coon. Okay, so they're on his trail. Reuben said if he crosses the river up to the buck ford, it's the ghost coon, as that's the way he always runs. Okay, so they're waiting to see if this coon goes a specific route, because that's the way that the ghost coon usually goes. We stood and listened. Sure enough, the voices of my dogs were silent for a few minutes. Old Dan, a more powerful swimmer than Little Ann, was the first to open up after crossing over. She was close behind him. Reuben said, "That's him all right. That's the ghost coon." They crossed the river again. We waited. Rainey said, "You may as well get your money out now." I told him to just wait a little while and I'd show him the ghost coon's hide. So Rainey's saying, "Oh, you're already going to lose. They're not going to get him." And Billy said, "You just wait. I'm going to get him. My hounds will get him." This brought a loud laugh from Rainey, which sounded like someone had dropped an empty bucket on a gravel bar and then had kicked it. The wily old coon crossed the river several times but couldn't shake my dogs from his trail. He cut out from the bottoms, walked a rail fence, and jumped from it into a thick canebrake. He piled into an old slough. Where it emptied into the river, he swam to the middle. Doing opposite to what most coons do, which is swim downstream, he swam upstream. He stopped at an old drift in the middle of it. Okay, so this coon is just crossing the river several times, going upstream when most coons go downstream, just doing a lot of different things. Little Ann found him. When she jumped him from the drift, old Dan was far downriver searching for the trail. If he could have gotten there in time, it would have been the last of the ghost coon, but Little Ann couldn't do much by herself in the water. He fought his way free from her, swam to our side, and ran upstream. I could hear old Dan coming through the bottoms on the other side, bawling at every jump. I could feel the driving power in his voice. We heard him when he hit the water to cross over. It sounded like a cow had jumped in. Little Ann was warming up the ghost coon. I could tell by her voice that she was close to him. Reaching our side, old Dan tore out after her. He was a mad hound. His deep voice was telling her he was coming. We were trotting along, following my dogs, when I heard Little Ann's bawling stop. Okay, so Little Ann had him in the water, but she needed help from old Dan because he's the powerful one. And old Dan was kind of a lot further downriver, so it took him a while to get there. And then all of a sudden her little bawl stopped. "Wait a minute," I said. "I think she's treed him. Let's give her time to circle the tree to make sure he's there." Old Dan opened up, bawling treed. Reuben started on. "Something's wrong," I said. "I can't hear Little Ann." Rainey spoke up. "Maybe the ghost coon ate her up." I glared at him. That was a mean thing to say. Hurrying on, we came to my dogs. Old Dan was bawling at a hole in a large sycamore that had fallen into the river. At that spot, the bank was a good 10 feet above the water level. As the big tree had fallen in, the roots had been torn and twisted from the ground. The jagged roots, acting as a drag, had stopped it from falling all the way into the stream. The trunk lay on a steep slant from the top of the bank to the water. Looking down, I could see the broken, tangled mass of the top. Debris from floods had caught into the limbs, forming a drift. So there's a tree that fell down, but it hadn't fallen all the way into the stream. So it was just kind of like sideways. It's kind of like the other one that was kind of in the tree, and the coon went in there and then started backtracking, and they couldn't find that coon. But this is kind of similar. The tree's kind of fallen down, but not all the way. Old Dan was trying to dig and gnaw his way into the log. Pulling him from the hole, I held my lantern and looked down into the dark hollow. I knew that somewhere down below the surface there had to be another hole in the trunk, as water had filled the hollow to the river level. Okay. Reuben, looking over my shoulder, said that coon couldn't be in there. If he was, he'd be drowned. I agreed. Rainey spoke up. You ready to pay off? He asked. I told you them hounds couldn't tree the ghost coon. I told him the show wasn't over. Little Ann had never ball treed, and I knew she wouldn't until she knew exactly where the coon was. Working the bank up and down and not finding the coon, she swam across the river and worked the other side. For a good half hour, she searched that side before she came back across to where old Dan was. She sniffed around the hollow log. Okay, we might as well get away from here, Rainey said. They ain't going to find the ghost coon. It sure looks that way, Reuben said. I told them I wasn't giving up until my dogs did. You just want to be stubborn, Reuben said. I'm ready for my money now. So the dogs are still looking for the coon, but the Pritchard boys are saying, okay, you're just being stubborn. They're not going to find it. It's already done. You just need to pay us. I asked him to wait a few minutes. Ain't no use, he said. No hound yet ever treed that ghost coon. Hearing a whine, I turned around. Little Ann had crawled up onto the log, and was inching her way down the slick trunk towards the water. I held my lantern up so I could see better. Spraddle-legged, claws digging into the bark, she was easing her way down. You better get her out of there, Reuben said. If she gets down in that old treetop, she'll drown. Reuben didn't know my little Ann. Once her feet slipped, I saw her hindquarters fall off to one side. She didn't get scared. Slowly, she eased her legs back up on the log. I made no reply. I just watched and waited. Little Ann eased herself into the water, swimming to the drift. She started sniffing around. In places, it was thin and her legs would break through. Climbing, clawing, and swimming, she searched the drift over, looking for the lost trail. So she's still trying slowly, so that she doesn't fall in. She's trying to just sniff out the coon. I saw when she stopped searching. With her body half in the water and her front feet curved over a piece of driftwood, she turned her head and looked towards the shore. I could see her head twisting from side to side. I could tell by her actions that she had gotten the scent. With a low whine, she started back. I told Reuben, I think she smells something. Slowly and carefully, she worked her way through the tangled mass. I lost sight of her when she came close to the undermined bank. She wormed her way under the overhang. I could hear her clawing and wallowing around, and then all hell broke loose. Out from under the bank came the biggest coon I had ever seen, the ghost coon. Oh, so she didn't give up, and then she made him come out. He came out right over Little Ann. She caught him in the old treetop. I knew she was no match for him in that tangled mass of limbs and logs. He fought his way free and swam for the opposite bank. She was right behind him. Old Dan didn't wait, look, or listen. He piled off the 10-foot bank and disappeared from sight. I looked for him. I knew he was tangled in the debris under the surface. I started to take off my overalls, but stopped when I saw his red head shoot up from out of the water. Bawling and clawing his way free of the limbs and logs, he was on his way. On reaching midstream, the ghost coon headed downriver, with Little Ann still on his trail. Okay, so they're just swimming now, and Little Ann's over after him, and Old Dan is after both of them. We ran down the riverbank. I could see my dogs clearly in the moonlight. The ghost coon was about 15 feet ahead of Little Dan. About 25 yards behind them came Old Dan, trying so hard to catch up. I whooped to them. Reuben grabbed a pole, saying he may come out on this side. Knowing the ghost coon was desperate, I wondered what he would do. Reaching a gravel bar below the high bank, we ran out on it into the water's edge. And then the ghost coon did something I never expected. Coming even with us, he turned from midstream and came straight for us. I heard Reuben yell, "Here he comes!" He turns his way through the shallows and ran right between us. Reuben swung his pole, missed the coon, and almost hit Little Ann. The coon headed for the river bottoms with her right on his heels. The bawling of Little Ann and our screaming and hollering made so much noise I didn't hear Old Dan coming. He tore out of the river, plowed into me, and knocked me down. We ran through the bottoms, following my dogs. I thought the ghost coon was going back to the sycamore log, but he didn't. He ran upriver. Okay, so it's just crazy right now. So the coon is running. Little Ann is after him. Old Dan's still trying to catch up, so he's knocked Billy down. Reuben is trying to hit the coon with a pole, but he missed, almost hitting little Ann. Okay, and now the coon is running upriver. While hurrying after him, I looked over at Rainy. For once in his life, I think he was excited. He was whooping and screaming and falling over logs and limbs. I felt good all over. Glancing over at me, Rainy said, "They ain't got him yet." The ghost coon crossed the river time after time. Seeing that he couldn't shake Old Ann and Little Ann from his trail, he cut through the river bottoms and ran out into an old field. At this maneuver, Reuben said to Rainy, "He's heading for that tree." "What tree?" I asked. "You'll see," Rainy said. "When he gets tired, he always heads for that tree. That's where he gets his name, the ghost coon. He just disappears." "If he disappears, my dogs will disappear with him," I said. Rainy laughed. I had to admit one thing. The Pritchard boys knew the habits of the ghost coon. I knew he couldn't run all night. He had already far surpassed any coon I had ever chased. "They're just about there," Reuben said. Okay, so they're saying that once he gets tired of running everywhere, he'll just go up like a specific tree. And Reuben said he's heading over there. Just then I heard Old Ann bark treed. I waited for little Ann's voice. I didn't hear her. I wondered what it could be this time. "He's there all right," Reuben said. "He's in that tree." "Well, come on," I said. "I want to see that tree." "You might as well get your money out," Rainy said. I told him he had said that once before back in the riverbank. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 12. So it's getting exciting, and it almost seems like these boys, even though they're supposedly no good and all this stuff, it almost seems like they have a lot in common with Billy, right? They probably don't have the best family life, like the same kind that Billy has, where he has a mom who cares so much about him, and you know, his dad's not doing bad things. He's living a honest, he's making an honest living and living an honest life. But it seems like these boys have a lot in common with Billy and being coon hunters. So might be a friendship. Who knows? We'll see.